Hi everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 3rd, where we are finishing up A Midsummer Night's Dream and beginning our third drama, which happens to be A Raisin in the Sun. And in terms of A Midsummer Night's Dream, you can see in the notes below the Hoffman film that we viewed from 1999 had a budget of $11 million, earned 16.1 million in the box office. So I think we can say that it was successful. They filmed between March of 1998 and May of 1998. And the location obviously was Italy, since we got these wonderful outdoor scenes. And some of the themes we've talked about is that love makes everybody, regardless of their age, their status, their gender, an idiot. At least Shakespeare's equal opportunity. Love can destroy friendships, as we saw with Hermia and Helena. Love is like a spell, and it's like being bewitched when one is in love and they're no longer in control. Love is like a dream. It may be that love is unreal, or perhaps temporary, or even a nightmare, though love can also be a wonderful dream as well. That the standards of beauty need not represent tall and blonde female. It could be, perhaps, short and brunette, as we see with Hermia. That female figures can defy powerful male figures. Not always, but sometimes. Expect complications in Shakespeare. Certainly, we see how Hermia defies her father, and at the ending of the play, she gets her own way. Yet, we can also see how someone like Queen Titania is not able to get her own way, and in fact, she's debased and humiliated, as well as losing the changeling child. Then you have somebody in the middle who, let's say, Helena, appears on the surface to be weak and passive, certainly by 2024 standards. And yet, as she herself says, women were not made to woo, and she's put into the position of pursuer, and she is able to successfully get her desire. A Titania is in direct contrast, I think, to something like a Hermia or even a Helena. And then we've got a Hippolyta, who is someplace in the middle, the queen of the Amazons, who has been conquered. Obviously, she's not happy about it, but yet she's come to some sort of resolution and understanding for our happy ending. A happy ending that might seem somewhat problematic for contemporary audiences. I once had a professor in college say that both men in the play, Lysander and Demetrius, are jerks. It's just a question of which one is the worst jerk. Nevertheless, we see forgiveness all around at the ending of the play so that we can get that happy ending. And we know how important virginity is for female, and her worth is determined on her based on her virginity, so much so that a woman would be seen as damaged goods if she was not virginal. And yet Shakespeare decides to set the play in Midsummer, one of the most sexually charged pagan holidays that exists, and also makes reference to May Day, another sexually charged day. So we see that contrast and tension between the two. However, we should assume that the women are virginal. Note, for instance, how Hermia doesn't want to be tempted by having Lysander lie next to her in the woods. And she says, lie further off, thou rhymest prettily. And Helena, as she's chasing Demetrius in the woods, he says to her, if you continue, I will do thee mischief in the woods. So basically, he's threatening her virginity at that point. And earlier in the play, when we hear that one of the suitors has made love to Nidar's daughter, that means he's wooed Nidar's daughter. It's not necessarily the idea of consummation. And of course, the donkey and the ass, which Bottom would have been turned into, was known in the Renaissance as the most well-endowed creature of the animal kingdom. So there's lots of possibilities for sexual bawdiness and punning here. And we know that in addition to all of these themes, we have all of the complexities with the writing, that we should expect poetry, so we should expect rhyme, iambic pentameter, a 10-syllable line, including lots of symbolism, and Shakespeare mixing verse or poetry with prose and complete sentences, sometimes to make commentary about a character's status or to make commentary about a character's ascent or descent. That poetry should be reserved for the higher classes. However, a higher class could begin speaking prose if they experienced a descent. Or perhaps the lower classes could speak poetry if they were experiencing an ascent. And you can see that in the notes below in the third section. I don't believe I shared this with you. It's a brief video about, of all things, a children's tale, The Three Little Pigs, but done in Shakespearean language. And it's also comedic. It's about 4 minutes long or so I encourage you to watch it. And I think what you will find, in addition to the punchline at the end, is that if we know the plot ahead of time, and I would suspect most people do know the plot of The Three Little Pigs, then ultimately you can really enjoy the nuances of the language. And I use that as an illustration for Midsummer. I know that if this is your first exposure, it's probably not an easy read, but each time you're exposed to either a reading or a performance of any Shakespearean play, in this instance Midsummer, it becomes easier and you can get to a sense of some of the nuances. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the quotations because they illustrate some of the nuances. Lots of great quotes in this play. But you can see in the fourth section of the notes below from Act 1, one of my favorite quotes is when Lysander is showing his wit, when he's talking to Demetrius and says, and he's talking about Hermia, "You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermia's." Act 1, Scene 1, line 93 through 94. And note that Shakespearean plays are divided into act, scene, line. We don't need to rely on page number, so it doesn't matter what edition we're using. And in the parentheses after the quote, we put act and then a period, and then scene and then a period, and then ultimately line, or lines in this particular instance. Learning a little bit about the history of the background of the play, Lysander says that Demetrius has made love to Neater's daughter, Helena. Again, made love is to woo. That's in Act 1, Scene 1, line 107. Basically, what he's saying is that prior to the play, Demetrius had vowed himself to Helena. So I guess we could say it's a happy ending when at the ending of the play, Helena and Demetrius are back as a couple. Granted, Demetrius has been manipulated through love juice, but we could see this as a restoration of order because he had committed himself prior to the play to Helena. One of the morals of the play, and there's several, but a very famous line by Lysander in Act 1, Scene 1, line 134. "The course of true love never did run smooth." And just to give you an idea of good rhyme as opposed to bad rhyme, Hermia, and it's a very short scene, a very short speech, Act 1, Scene 1, line 202 through 207. Not only is it utilizing rhyme, it also is forwarding plot in a very seamless and natural way. "Take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then what graces in my love do dwell, that he had turned a heaven unto a hell." That's in direct contrast to another speech shortly thereafter by Bottom. We know Bottom is an ass, a figurative ass, and eventually he becomes a literal ass as well through Puck's intervention. But we see him using rhyme, but just because he might have rhyme or meter, that doesn't necessarily mean it's any good. "The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far, and make and mar the foolish fates." Act 1, Scene 2, line 31 through 38. And not only is this nonsense, but at the ending he declares this was lofty, so he self-congratulates himself. So in Act 2, one of the things we see are the power dynamics that occur in all relationship. Notice that Shakespeare gives us all different variations of relationship, whether it be the stages of relationship from dating to engagement to actual marriage, or whether it be based on status, where we've got kings and queens of fairies, kings and queens of human world, nobles, and even a laborer falling in love. Different ages. The assumption is that the nobles are younger than, let's say, Hippolyta and Titania. Even though again, Titania isn't necessarily human. So we see lots of variations, and we always come to the same conclusion that everybody acts like an idiot in love. But in terms of power dynamics, we see Titania trying to take the upper hand over Oberon. It's one of the reasons why he's so angry with her. Act 2, Scene 1, line 63, when she says, I have forsworn his bed and company. So she's using basically intimacy as a power play, a weapon, if you will. And Oberon has made it his business to basically enact revenge. Not only will he take this changeling child, but he will also humiliate and degrade Titania by having the love juice placed on her eyes through Puck, so that the first thing she sees, she falls in love with. Again, another message about love, that when we're in love, we no longer pay attention to that which was previously important to us. For instance, changeling boys. So one line in Act 2 that might seem odd, Act 2, Scene 1, line 186, is when Oberon says, I am invisible. That's a cue for us. Basically, the fairies are invisible to the human world. Again, it's difficult to show invisibility on stage, though we think during the Renaissance there might have been a special costume to denote invisibility. But when you see language like that, it's really to cue in the audience. Now, of course, the threat that I was talking about earlier that Demetrius levies against Helena in Act 2, Scene 1, line 236 to 237, if thou follow me, I shall do thee mischief in the wood, threatening to take her virginity. And Gender's response by Helena when she says in Act 2, Scene 1, line 240 to 42, your wrongs do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We should be wooed. We were not made to woo. And, of course, Hermia showing her modesty in the same act when she says in Act 2, Scene 2, line 57 to Lysander after they've run off into the woods, for love and courtesy lie further off in humane modesty. Again, trying to protect her virginity, especially because they're in the wilderness at this point, the forest, that which is wild and untamed, in direct contrast to Athens, which is the land of civilization and order. Act 3, again, you can think about all of the acts falling on a pyramid structure, with Act 1, the lower end of the left side of the pyramid. We're introduced to characters. Act 2, and this is the beginning of the ascent of that pyramid. This is where we begin to get conflict. Act 3, the tip of that pyramid, and this is where we get the height of conflict, which is exactly what we will find in this play. Act 4 is on the right side of the pyramid and the beginning of descent, and then Act 5 would be at the bottom of the pyramid on the right side, and that would be resolution. And in Midsummer, it almost seems as if the first 4 acts are enough, and that resolution occurs in Act 4, but Act 5 is brilliant because it allows Shakespeare to give all kinds of commentary. So the 5th act, while it might seem superfluous, is anything but. But in terms of Act 3, if we're looking for another moral, it comes from, of all people, Bottom. And this is a great illustration of how a lower level character has a certain level of insight, whether they're conscious of it or not. When Bottom says in Act 3, Scene 2, line 143 through 144, reason and love keep little company nowadays. Another moral, and this is from Puck. Of course, Puck is the only character not involved in a love relationship, where he says in Act 3, Scene 2, line 115, what fools these mortals be. Of course, we could argue that the fairies are just as foolish. And then the insults that come fast and furious in Act 3, where former best friends have now become former best enemies. And some of these insults may not seem like they're insults, but they would be. So the idea that Helena calls Hermia a puppet. Act 3, Scene 2, line 288. A puppet is someone who's controlled by somebody else. And also a puppet is small. So this is in reference to Hermia's stature or lack of stature. And Hermia responds in Act 3, Scene 2, line 296. You painted maypole to Helena. Painted would be cosmetics, which is something that would be associated with loose women, strumpets, for instance. The act of deception, wearing cosmetics. And a maypole is in reference to Helena's appearance. She's tall and thin like a maypole. But if you're familiar with the maypole, which is something that is danced around on May Day being a day of sexual fertility, the symbolism of the maypole is that it's supposed to represent phallus, which gives a whole different sense to maypole. So she basically has just insulted her friend by calling her a strumpet and also calling her a phallus. And we see how quickly love turns into hate. Lysander now calls his former love an Ethiop, Act 3, Scene 2, line 258, and tells her to go away. Away you, Ethiop. This is in reference to her dark features, her dark hair and eyes in Ethiopia. And Lysander continues and says in Act 3, Scene 2, line 268 to 269, should I hurt her, strike her, kill her dead? So this is his first default, is that he's going to hurt or even kill Hermia, and then he decides not to. Again, illustrating how thin that line is between love and hate. And Lysander continues on, saying in Act 3, Scene 2, line 327 to 329, what he says to Hermia is, get you gone, you dwarf, you minimus, you bee, you acorn. All of these are references to the idea that she has small stature. And then in Act 4, where it seems like we get resolution, where Theseus ultimately makes a decision. And he decides in Act 4, Scene 1, line 179, that he will overbear Aegeus' will and allow the couples to stay together, the nobles, as they wish. This is probably the best of all possible outcomes because they're all happy with one another. So the only one that would be distraught is Aegeus, though it is somewhat surprising in that Hermia has defied her father, and instead of being punished for that, by the ending of the play, she actually gets her heart's desire. And Helena, as again problematic as her character may be, also gets her heart's desire by the ending of the play. So we see some rather strong statements about gender. And another moral that comes so appropriately from Bottom, Act 4, Scene 1, line 206, when he says, man is but an ass. And of course, Bottom was just a literal ass, and now he continues as a figurative one. Shakespeare is, of nothing else, if nothing else, a businessman. So he knows the importance of being able to flatter those in power. So what seems to be a completely unimportant element of dialogue is actually quite important when ultimately we have the king and queen speaking to one another. And this is Queen Hippolyta. And this happens to be King Theseus. Again, Theseus has conquered Hippolyta in war. And he says they're talking about what happens when their subjects don't offer them proper greetings. And basically what Theseus is saying is that he doesn't take offense. He doesn't think that there's any ill will shown. The reason why they don't get proper greetings is because the subjects are so nervous they're unable to give a proper greeting. So he sees that as being highly flattering. Or another way of saying this, where I've come great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, shiver and look pale, in conclusion dumbly broken off. Yet I picked the welcome. Act 4, Scene 1, line 93 to 100. And the assumption is that Queen Elizabeth would be in the audience, the Queen during Shakespeare's time, watching this, and she would liken herself in much the same manner, that she too has enough grace to be able to understand that when she isn't given a proper welcome, it's not in any way an offense, but it really is a form of flattery because someone is so awe-stricken by her presence. And then we have Act 5, which seems to be irrelevant, but of course it serves multiple functions. Obviously, it provides the opportunity for humor, including some physical humor, which is something that you might not necessarily get from reading the play. It also gets an opportunity, or gives us an opportunity, for Shakespeare to illustrate what his contemporaries are doing. And basically, Shakespeare's competition is writing poor plays and acting them out even more poorly, as we see illustrated through Pyramus and Thisbe. Of course, Pyramus and Thisbe is a love story, and a love story gone awry should remind you of Romeo and Juliet, which is also a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare, because it's thought that Romeo and Juliet came out at around the same time as A Midsummer. So either Shakespeare is advertising his new play by showing us a play that is about love and suicide that's very poor, And, of course, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet will be anything but poor. Or he is reminding us, because Romeo and Juliet has already been seen or shown, and again, we're not exactly sure of the dates. Compare Pyramus and Thisbe to a play you might have already seen, Romeo and Juliet, and see the contrast. Either way, it's brilliant from a business person's perspective. There also is the lack of insight that the characters show, that they are all watching Pyramus and Thisbe and mocking it, rightly so. It's quite humorous, and it reminds me of an elementary school production in some respects. It's that simplistic. But they never once stopped to pause and think that they themselves were equally absurd when it came to love. So Hippolytus says, for instance, in Act 5, Scene 1, line 210, "This is the silliest stuff I ever heard." But this shows her lack of insight, because she doesn't acknowledge how she herself and all of these other characters were acting like idiots in love. But the true message is for us watching this play, because if we are watching Pyramus and Thisbe and mocking it and not realizing that we ourselves have been idiotic in love, then we've learned nothing from A Midsummer Night's Dream. So Shakespeare is at least equal opportunity in terms of his critiques with love, and he probably has offended a whole host of people. So having that very famous ending speech makes a lot of sense, delivered through Puck. Act 5, Scene 1, line 423, when Puck says, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, no more yielding but a dream." And notice how important dreams and slumbering are in terms of sleep. They both share parallels. When you're asleep, you're not awake, you don't see the truth, you oftentimes are dreaming. It's something that's a fantasy world. And at one point, Puck says, "If I am an honest Puck," and we have unearned luck to escape the serpent's tongue. But the thing is that Puck is not honest. So even this supposed apology is a wink and a nod from either Puck, the character, the actor playing Puck, or even Shakespeare himself through the actor, through the character. But because Shakespeare is himself a kind of Puck-like character, or at least in some ways, Shakespeare and Puck can control and manipulate action. So that said, when Puck says if he's honest, we know he's not honest. And later on he says, "If I am a liar," or if you don't believe me, call me a liar. And the thing is, he is a liar. So this is a kind of backhanded apology that we can't take too seriously. To escape the serpent's tongue, that's the booing and the hissing. A serpent would hiss, much like you would boo and hiss in an audience. And when he asks, "Give me your hands if we be friends," he's asking for applause at that point, and basically saying good night unto you all. So this is his way of saying goodbye. But one of the more interesting things about Act 5, and I remember being quite surprised by it when I learned about it as an undergraduate, was the bawdiness, which may not seem very evident in the play. And this is in the Pyramus and Thisbe performance. And what seemed like an innocent line is anything but. I remember my professor talking about this. So I'm not taking credit, nor am I taking blame for this line. In Act 5, Scene 1, line 190 to 191, when Thisbe says, "My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee." And I remember very clearly my professor saying this was a reference to oral sex, that "my cherry lips have often kissed thy stones," stones in reference to testicles, "thy stones with lime and hair," that being in reference to pubic hair. Especially because the line beforehand is, "O wall, full often has thou heard my moans," which could be a sexual ecstasy. So, of course, Shakespeare wrote for the masses. All levels of audience would be there. And the assumption is that children might not necessarily have gotten the double meaning of this line, but I suspect many adults did. So never put it past Shakespeare to have a line that has a multiplicity of meaning. That's one of the elements of Shakespeare that makes him so complex as a writer. And that said, I hope that A Midsummer Night's Dream is a little bit less confusing and intimidating now that we've seen performance and we've talked a little bit about the play itself. And I will be getting to your discussion forum responses very soon and catching up with that as well. And as you know, that's only one of the three plays that we are reading in our drama section. The first being Oedipus, the second being A Midsummer Night's Dream. And of course, watching a performance is never a substitute for reading, it's merely a supplement. And now finally, we get to A Raisin in the Sun. And A Raisin in the Sun is a more contemporary piece. I think you'll find it to be a much easier read. It's set in America. It's set in a more current time period. The language is much more familiar. This was the text that was not included in our textbook. I ordered it as a separate text, but you can see in the notes below in section 9, I have also included the web link for this. And again, we'll watch performance. One of the nice things about the performance for Raisin in the Sun was considered to be the definitive performance, and this is with Sidney Poitier in the 1960s. And not only because Sidney Poitier is such a superb actor, but also because the playwright Lorraine Hansberry worked very closely on the film adaptation. She created the screenplay, so this is basically her vision of what a stage play would have been like on film. And of course, we know that film takes liberties, and we know too that film offers opportunities. We certainly saw that with A Midsummer Night's Dream. They decided to set it in Victorian times, which was not historically accurate, but the Victorian period comes with some associations for general audiences about repression, and certainly sexual purity is an important element in the play. The Shakespearean version decided to have the characters on bicycles. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense outside of that it's visually appealing, and the fact that they were able to film on location in Italy, definitely that expands the play so that we can focus on the idea of the beauty of the surroundings. And we see how even something subtle like a change of weather from daytime to nighttime or from sun to rain helps to show changes in mood, for instance. So those are the kinds of things that you can do in a theatrical performance that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do on stage. Though I'll continue to argue that I think the biggest error that was made in the theatrical production that we saw of A Midsummer, and there are many productions you can see, but I wanted us to see this one because it was a Hollywood version, so they used A-list actors, and they understood that their audience probably had not read, or not all of their audience had read A Midsummer, so they were trying to make it as accessible as possible, and I think they did a fairly good job of doing that. And of course they cut because the play is long, so, and most Hollywood audiences expect somewhere between an hour and a half to 2-ish hours. So cuts needed to be made. But there really was no reason to make the character of Bottom married in the film version as far as I'm concerned. He's certainly not married in the text. I would argue that it's important that he not be married. It's one of the reasons why he's able to make some statements about love, like man is but an ass, in the way that other characters can't, because he, even though has been manipulated, or I should say Titania, has been manipulated through love Jews to love him, and he is, going with it, as ridiculous as it might seem, he doesn't have the kind of love conflicts as, let's say, the nobles do, or even the fairies do. So I think that's why he has an element of separation, of not being as perhaps influenced or misled by love as some of the other characters. But for Raisin in the Sun, I think you're going to see a pretty close adaptation to the play itself. The biggest difference will be that some of the scenes have been deleted because of length. Also cost is an issue as well, but mostly it's of length because this film version is a good 2 hours. So this is a long version, which we will start watching next class. And also, I think that it's interesting to note that Lorraine Hansberry used many of the same actors who were on the stage version in the film version to give it that kind of sense of continuity. But there have been other adaptations since then, and how I wanted to end with a little bit of introductory material about A Raisin in the Sun. So you'll see in the 9th section, I have a few brief videos for you to watch. The first talks a little bit about Lorraine Hansberry and actually putting the play on and how she was able to translate that over into film. The second was of an adaptation that was done in 2014 with Denzel Washington, an actor you might be familiar with, and with very high reviews. The biggest issue was Denzel Washington's age. A Raisin in the Sun, the main character, whom Denzel Washington plays, is supposed to be in his mid-30s, and Denzel Washington was in his 50s. But he's very youthful looking 50s, and of course with the magic of makeup and lighting, that could sort of be obscured on stage. But you'll see a little bit of Denzel Washington's thoughts about A Raisin in the Sun and his performance in A Raisin in the Sun. And then the last video, again, very brief, just a few minutes long, that I wanted you to watch is of that same performance, but some of the other actors who were performing in the play. And what that leaves us with is our discussion forum question. As I said, I've fallen a little bit behind with grading discussion forums, but I will be catching up, and you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And this discussion forum will be due on Friday. And this is the 5th. And of course, if you need additional time, just let me know. Which quote did you like best in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? And it could be one of the quotes I've highlighted, or perhaps your own quote. Which quote did you like best in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? As we continue on next class, we're talking about a third play. We'll also start talking about our second paper, which is going to be very similar to what you did with paper 1. The distinction is that you would be writing about one of the dramas, whether it's text or it's performance, for Oedipus, Midsummer, or Raisin. Questions or prompts being the same, but I will review that as well. Whether or not you wanted to talk about contemporary relevance or not having contemporary relevance, whether or not you wanted to talk about inclusion in the canon or exclusion from the canon, or if you wanted to create your own paper topic, just as long as you have your paper topic approved by me. So at this point, if you handed in paper number 1 on time, you should have received it so that I can move forward with now some of the papers that I've received after the initial due date. So as I like to tell students, you're in the queue. I'm just working with other classes first who submitted in due dates after your due date because their due date was later, and then I can get around to going back to some of the later papers, but I'll certainly get them all back before you need to hand in your next writing assignments. In the event that if you wanted to rewrite it, you could. All you need to do is to take my comments into account, meet with me if you need further direction, and just hand in the original with my comments on it along with your revision, and you would get the higher of the 2 grades. And you would have up until the ending of the semester to do that. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And again, which quote did you like best in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? And I will see you next class, so to speak. Take care. Bye-bye.